Art Museum, and I am super thrilled to see all of you here. And I thank you for joining us for this program titled Knowing Through Looking, which is part of this year's Watson Professorship. We begin today's program by acknowledging with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. Today we are joined by Rina Banerjee and Ankush Arora, who will be in conversation about Banerjee's drawings that we see to your right and my left, and Mithila paintings that you see on your left. Rina Banerjee is the 2023 Jeanette K. Watson Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Humanities. Banerjee was born in Kolkata, India, and she lived briefly in Manchester and London before arriving in Queens, New York. Drawing on her multinational background and personal history as an immigrant, she focuses on ethnicity, race, migration, and American diasporic histories in her sculpture, drawings, and video art. Several examples of Banerjee's dynamic work are on view here as part of the exhibition Take Me to the Palace of Love, which is on view through May 14th. The Watson Professorship is presented by the Syracuse University Humanities Center in partnership with many co-sponsors, including the museum. Ankush Arora is an MA student in art history. He specializes in South Asian art, and he curated the selection of Mithila paintings from the region of Mithila that are on display as part of this exhibition. Following their conversation, we invite you to join us for tea and snacks in the Schaefer Galleria outside the museum. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ankush and Rina.
Thank you, Melissa, for this wonderful introduction to Rina and to the exhibition. And thank you, everyone, for coming all the way to the museum on this typically snowy Syracuse day. Before we begin this conversation, I want to thank the following individuals and institutions whose generous support and mentorship actually made it possible for me to curate this Mithila art wall that you see to your left and onto my right. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Melissa A. Ewan, the interim chief curator at Syracuse University Art Museum, and the entire team of the museum, led by interim director Emily Dittman, Professor Ramita Ray, the curator of this exhibition, associate professor, Department of Art and Music Histories, and director of undergraduate studies in history of architecture. Professor Ray is also my graduate advisor. Professor Emeritus of Anthropology, Dr. Susan Wadley, who has expanded the museum's collection of Mithila paintings, and many of the works that we see here have actually been gifted by Professor Wadley to the museum as a result of her deep research of Mithila painting and her visits to India as part of her research. And finally, I want to thank the South Asia Center at Syracuse University for awarding me the Bharati Memorial Grant, which also contributed to the research of the Mithila paintings at the SU Art Museum, which I conducted during fall semester of 2022. Now, before I begin speaking to Rina Banerjee, I want to make a quick introduction to Mithila art for all of you. Mithila paintings, as Melissa just pointed out, belongs to the region of Mithila in eastern India, bordering Nepal. I come from India, I was born in India. The art form dates back many centuries, involving women making paintings on the walls and the floors of their homes. And these paintings created auspicious settings for family rituals by depicted Hindu gods and goddesses that you can see on this wall, as well as wedding designs for nuptial chambers. And since the mid-20th century, Mithila art evolved from wall paintings to the medium of paper that we see here. Artists began to explore more contemporary themes, such as women's independence, which this particular painting focuses on, climate change, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. So this collection at the SU Art Museum and the Mithila Art Wall, it demonstrates these various changes that Mithila paintings underwent over the past few centuries, and the different ways in which artists have used line and color in these works based on their social and economic background. So that's a quick introduction to the Mithila art. You have these labels here placed next to the exhibits for your reference. With this introduction and without further ado, I will now turn to Rina to begin our conversation on Mithila art, which is titled Knowing Through Looking. My first question, Rina, your drawings here and the Mithila paintings are installed in a way, they face each other as if they are neighbors, as if they are speaking to each other like neighbors do. And they share a common space in this exhibition, which is about the power of love and how we need to rescue love in today's times. And I wanted to begin this conversation by asking you, what was your first reaction when you saw the Mithila works installed right across these wonderful drawings?
Hello, everybody. I think the main thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the Mithila paintings is something that I was already aware of and exposed to. And in many ways, contemporary art, modern art specifically, has this kind of quality of both line work and point. And so the optical quality of what we sometimes regard as tribal or folk art is very important in my work. And when I was in graduate school, I was specifically interested in Aboriginal work. And in many ways, that work, which has this kind of dual quality of both writing as well as image making, and has a kind of quality of flatness that allows you to, I think about it in terms of text, how we perceive text. There's a kind of strictness to the way that the image is placed, and at the same time, the lines require you to think about movement, the optical quality of which allows you to think of space very differently than a flat background. So in carrying it over to my work, I really considered what do these kinds of mark making in the range of scale do to a larger space. So everything from, if you look at the bottom painting, which is called Ugly Boy, requires you to look at these kinds of markings that are both made in paint and pen simultaneously. They create a fixed space, and then you also have these kind of atmospheric spaces that are made with watery paints of different kinds. And so how you prescribe and become influenced by a whole global range of mark making, which I think would be interesting to look at Mithila art in, as well as contemporary artists and modern artists, is very important in terms of how it influences what kind of meaning we bring away from it. And this is where I think contemporary art is useful.
Thank you for that response, Rina. I want to take this conversation further to talk about the iconography of Mithila paintings and its similarity that I saw with your own works. And one of the recurring images in the Mithila paintings, and perhaps all of us can orient ourselves to this painting on the wall, and I can point it for you. Thank you, Melissa. Is this painting, Mithila paintings, repeatedly show the iconography of Hindu gods and goddesses, such as this painting by Tara Devi. It actually shows the goddess Durga riding on a lion. And one of the reasons we selected this painting from the museum's collection was because the form of this goddess, she has many arms, as we can see, and she exudes a sense of ferociousness. And I thought that this form is very similar to the multi-armed women that we see in Rina's works right across the wall. And so, Rina, when you see these works together, I was wondering if you talk about the way in which the various ways the feminine is depicted in Mithila art.
Well, I'm less familiar with Mithila art than you are. But in my works where I have single figures, which is what I chose out of the whole kind of inventory of works for this show, there is a kind of, I would say, personalization of the figure that marks contemporary art for me. And a vulnerability that I think is ferocious. So if we can consider that to be ferocious, means being open to being vulnerable and fragile, and thinking of how we are placed in the world, intertwined with nature. I think nature is alluded to in a lot of these works, and the presence of other animals, small creatures, which you could see perhaps in the largest painting that I have with the bird. The coloration is very important as well. And in some of them, there is a kind of control over coloration of the body, where the face is a different color than the body. It's implying that the face is colored by the person, as in that particular painting where the golden dress is worn. And you can see through the dress, and you can see through the body. So seeing through the dress is less about making nudity available, but more that there is a vanishing quality to our own existence, to everything you see before you. So everything from the waters, to the trees, to the body itself, showing organs, and creating kind of metaphors to clouds, fire, making visible what is invisible, which is the atmosphere itself, to think about science being present and our knowledge of science, and to think of spirit, that the spirit that we are talking about is what we're thinking about in science, that the micro and the macro that we cannot see, that we cannot imagine without equipment, is something that is formidable in coming to an awareness of our spirituality, that all these things, if not seen, can be imagined, felt, and become part of our lives. So there is a feeling of constellations in these works. They're very filled with all kinds of markings to create no space that is empty. It is not like the landscape in the other room of the Hudson Valley, where there is an open horizon and a feeling of being able to penetrate that landscape into the far reaches and depths of a landscape. Here you have this kind of markings that create a fullness of life and a fullness of nature that I allude to in my work, and require me to imagine things that are even not possible.
And speaking a little bit more about the goddess Durga here in this painting, you were born in the city of Calcutta in the eastern part of India, and Calcutta, or Kolkata as it is called today, has a deep tradition of worshipping the goddess Durga, especially by praying to the enormous idols of Durga that are exhibited during the grand festival of Durga worship, or Durga Puja as it is called. And so when you look at this image of Durga, in any way, does it remind you of your own memory, perhaps associated with Calcutta, of your visits to India, or of the Durga Puja festival as well, either back in India or somewhere in the US?
Yeah, I think it's really important at that stage, when thinking about a place I would call my home culture, to realize that I have already, growing up in the U.S., rejected the idea that culture is anchored in a geographical space as the origin of culture. And that culture is something that really we make as people, as artists, as intellectuals, as educators, and those who are being educated. It's something that is both spiritual and intellectual and emotional. To be aware of this is in some ways kind of intersects all the different places that that culture can be, and to imagine it as a larger fold. And so for me, Kolkata is not just in, India, but it's around the world. And I think it's particularly important with the idea of worshiping, as you would put it, or puja, which I prefer to use, because it's not really worshiping, it's acknowledging, it's taking note, it's making space for an idea that fertility and migration are a very similar reference to our way of life that is about health, longevity, healthfulness, and embrace of everything. When I look at Durga's position with arms scattered and multiple, opened, I think of the embrace of the world, of nature. Durga, in that sense, is a natural phenomenon about all things that are alive and hopeful, I think, and plentiful. It's a harvest season time as well. So yellow is a significant color in my works. And you can see on the top I reference an angel who has a yellowed face. And so every color that I work with has references to meaning. They're not just to create balance in a composition as we were once taught in graduate school. And I think that's very important, and that the world scattered, if it be oceans and clouds, and I see here a globe or earth marked with continents and oceans. They are also colored in an unnatural way, unnatural to what we're accustomed to. And I think the kind of imagination we use or demonstrate in the artwork here, in these paintings, are actually closer to the truth that we feel, that we invest in meaning. So what is abstract, what is optical, what is not natural or representational comes closer to real meaning.
I like how you describe the idea of Durga as embracing everybody as an all-inclusive person, and that also ties up with the theme of love in this exhibition, despite Durga's ferociousness, as she's known for. And to stay with the subject of the feminine in your work, as you rightly pointed out, we see the feminine taking many forms in your drawings here. And this form kind of extends into the sculptures, for example, which is right behind us in Viola from New Orleans, which is installed in one of the galleries there. I wanted to know, what do you think is the role of the feminine in your work? How would you define it? Because there are these intersecting themes of diaspora and placemaking and belonging in your work, which you also made connections with Mithila art. And I was very curious to know the role of the feminine, and if there is a connection of the feminine with the theme of diaspora that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think those two are significant things to compare. Diaspora is about everything that is culture, every facet of a particular culture that can be understood. It is about allowing eternal growth. And I think the role, as you put it, of the feminine is more than just being female. And it is about the arching kind of project of nurturing, everything. And also this kind of proximity to creation itself. Where does creation belong? What kinds of bodies have access to creation? How we identify with creation, whether it's the earth, biology as we learn of it, or our bodies, how does it create? And therefore, you're really looking at ideas of destruction too, in that we explore alongside it. What is destructive, and what kind of roles that play? How is it gendered destruction as opposed to the feminine? I mean, work where it's demonstratively masculine is ugly boy below. And ugly boy, in some sense, is kind of absurd title in the sense that we really don't designate beauty or ugly to males as they're growing up. We are preoccupied with the beauty of females, and in rejection to some females, the idea of the body that is not white then becomes a seat of harboring all ugliness in the world that is female. So the position of beauty is only in the hands of a white face is very important. Or the position or the responsibility of being beautiful rests in that body. The female duality, that mean? Where does it take you? What does it imply? How do we express it in the body? Is it courage? Is it violence? Is it fear of vulnerability? And I think that when we make figurative work, which has gone through times of popularity as well as being unpopular as intellectual work, rejecting this kind of work, folk art, we really begin to realize that the body itself is a place that requires even more interpretation because of our ability to recognize the body. And that's where having multiple arms or kind of a different shape to the body than what is we perceive of is natural, forces you to think about what does this body want you to express in it. It's not that they're monstrous, but they are reconnecting with ideas of beauty to stretch what we understand of beauty in ways and what we assign to the body. And I think that's very important in taking away from work that is unconventional.
Speaking of diaspora, and as we know, one of the underlying themes of your residency, and specifically this exhibition, has been diaspora, and the question of where we belong as people who cross borders. And I want to actually bring our attention to a painting at the far end of this wall, which is a painting by Hema Devi. Thank you, Melissa. There's a painting by Hema Devi, which also made me think about place and belonging. And here's why. If I can actually, if you want to come closer to the painting, you're welcome to do that. So this painting actually shows Sita standing right under the tree. You're most welcome to come this side. Standing under the tree, and she's the heroine of the Hindu epic, which is the Ramayana. She's also the human incarnation of a Hindu goddess. And she actually has been kidnapped by this multi-armed demon, Ravana, from here. And he has actually imprisoned her in her grove, which is part of this island in Lanka. We have these two demonesses guarding her. And she's been kidnapped from where she was living, which was in a forest, which was her home, where she lived with her family. And she's living away from home, and when I was looking back at this painting while thinking about today's conversation, I was wondering if this painting focuses on a woman's distance. She's removed from her homeland, and the idea of being physically removed from the homeland is something that you also explore in your work. This is coming from a Hindu epic. It belongs to the Hindu tradition, which has been appropriated by several artists. And here we have your own contemporary practice, where you also focus on diaspora and distance from home. I was wondering if you would be able to make any connection with these two works based on the common theme of diaspora.
Well, I think the idea of diaspora is that there is no inside and outside. And if you can think of home in the same way, we have an idea of boundary, fences that we create to designate what is our home. what is our street, which one is our neighborhood, what is your zip code, which country you belong to. And this exercise that we practice from when we're little about belonging to a place is a very possessive one. And it's possessive of not only your body and your ideas, but it's possessive of that land, property, real estate. And for me, diaspora holds a kind of hopefulness that we will let go of this ownership of place, of geography, and therefore create a kind of borderless place that we call the whole earth as being home, that is shared, and that creates boundaries that are not based on ownership. I'm not suggesting that boundaries are not important, but of course all of you have boundaries. When the day ends, we must end and put our pencil down and go home to rest. When it's lunchtime, we have boundaries about that to help us. And those boundaries, which are very time-centered, create for us a flow and movement that keeps us intimate in communities. So at lunchtime, you can go and be with your real friends, not your classmate friends. And so all these kinds of movements with boundaries that are specialized to create different directions of movement, an intricate path of entry and exit that can really fulfill all the people that you are inside of you is very essential. And diaspora manages that. So there is no demon, no border, no passport required. If you could see that demon may be, passport control, for example, right? And then the forest that she lives in, that is containment, restricted, is a forest of endless possibility rather than a place that she needs to protect herself, to be hidden, disguised. And so all these ideas of disguise, camouflage, where they become necessary to enter into other locations, can now be reconsidered as places of transformation rather than disguise. And that's very important in this metaphor.
Thank you. You talked about flow and movement with respect to diaspora, and if we can spend a little bit more time on this painting, and you're all welcome to come back here for a few more minutes. In this painting, we see the monkey god here. His name is Hanuman, and he is actually flying in from the upper left of this painting to meet Sita, who's standing under the tree. And what he's bringing with him is a ring from her husband, who is Ram, the hero of Ramayana, the mortal form of a Hindu god. He's also the idol king and the idol husband. So when Hanuman brings this ring for Sita, and you have these three lines denoting a movement of the ring from his hand to her hand, in a way that these demonesses don't notice. And these lines kind of, mirror the way we see these forms, and you can describe these forms to us. These forms emerging out of the mouth of this woman. Is there some kind of a strange similarity between these two works?
I don't know about strange, but I'll say that the movement of things that are not seen are actual, and no better place to have experienced that in the last 3 years with COVID. Things move without our knowledge, is for sure. And this is something that I'm very curious about and have been interested in my work, the idea of what is contagious. Now, what is contagious is not always disease only, but it is your ideas. And your ideas are contagious to other people who absorb it without their own knowledge. There's a great power in being able to speak that allows to change people's mind. And there's great power in the knowledge that we seek in the university, because that knowledge then obviously can change your mind. And then if you can imagine that what is transformative is the way you allow that change to you're in some ways all creating and recreated in view of that knowledge. And that's something to be aware of. I'm very interested in what leaves the body. And you can see that what leaves the body is not only through our mouth, but other openings, and even things that are not open. So her fingers seem to bleed out all kinds of things. And there's every pore in someone's body is in the moment of exchange between the atmosphere and the world. To consider that your body is so open as you would imagine diaspora to be open. There is a whole world of exchanges that await you, that allow you to be fearless of the world and all that moves in the world. And I think that allows you to have a feeling of a heightened spirituality that enables you to give impact. How much power do you have in the world? So if anything, power is about becoming aware of the world to the point of having this conversation that you are participating in this large world. And it doesn't matter how small or invisible you are, you can be that contagion. And that's very important.
Thank you, Rina, for that response. Let's move on to the next part of the conversation and settle down as well. What struck me about your drawings here, most of them, and the Mithila paintings, was the modest dimensions of these works, especially when we compare the quote-unquote small formats of these paintings and these drawings to your monumental sculptures. And I thought not to discount the smallness of the size. The smallness creates a kind of an intimacy about these paintings and these drawings, especially the ones here on the right-hand side. And this intimacy created a kind of a close looking at these works, which was also enhanced by the fact, because they are all made on paper. And since we are, to come back to the exhibition's theme, since we are talking about love in this exhibition, do you think that the whole act of working on paper creates a kind of an intimacy, in a way that the outcome of the work also makes us think about love?
Well, there is this idea that the materials that you use allow you to evaluate the work. This is especially demonstrated in the art market. A painting that is on canvas is worthy of a higher price than something that is on paper. And something that is on wood is even more valuable than canvas. The durability of the material is a factor, and the longevity of the material is a factor in evaluating what is important and what is has more traction in the art world. And so intimacy, when thinking about intimacy, we often associate intimacy with what we're familiar with. We're more familiar, all of you, with putting your pen down on a piece of paper as you are right now. And so that creates an intimacy. You've been writing on paper all this time. You've been probably drawing on paper, doodling perhaps. And so when you see artwork that is in paper or on paper, it becomes an intimate experience out of familiarity. What is not intimate is that which is not accessible. So I think it's especially important in learning about these kinds of work that they were put on walls inside of someone's home. And that was the original way that you saw, how do you pronounce it? Mithila paintings. I love that idea that these homes were painted for the welcoming of a newly married couple. And there were signs of health and fertility and hopefulness and joy and all those things that could make that union an important one to the whole community. I think that has a lot more intimacy, and yet it's not paper. So when you walk into spaces to see art, it's really important that you think about your relationship to those materials, not just what's on the surface of those materials. So I bring you to my sculpture with materials that I think and hope you're more familiar with than, let's say, if it was a beautiful sculpture made of white marble in the Metropolitan, right? What are the materials that bring intimacy to you? And so I picked out plastic and beads and fabric, glass and sand and moss and little dolls and broken dolls and little coins, seashells, things that you're familiar with. And for me, they create an intimacy in my conversation with you. So our conversation are as equals in allowing intimacy to be that bridge between our differences. And these differences are exaggerated with the division of geographical space and land between nations, between oceans. How many oceans away is your home compared to mine? And so these bridges of intimacy is what rescues love, in fact, that we are reconsidering and we're mentally moving our bodies away from what we were growing up to believe. I'm from this country, I'm from this race, and I'm from this culture. So that is a very important kind of tool and a place of empowerment for human beings to produce community. And I'm kind of losing my place.
Well, I will give you a break, and I will pick up on one point that you talked about. You very nicely talked about the idea of intimacy that actually unfolds across these various registers. You know, imagine a group of women in Mithila centuries ago getting together, painting the walls of their homes to welcome a newly wedded couple. So the creating of the Mithila painting on the wall creates one kind of an intimacy. And there's an intimacy, of course, in the union of two people, for example. And here you also talked about the intimacy of collecting objects, which you repurpose, you use, you adapt to your own sculptures, for example, that we see here in these galleries. And then that intimacy sort of unfolds across lands, as you mentioned, and that is also tied with the idea of love not being rooted to one place. Since we are talking about intimacy, and you talked about how many of us in the audience would be using their pen to make doodles or scribble something else, and no offense, I was wondering if when we talk about drawing and intimacy, is the act of holding a pen or applying ink to the paper, that is also an act of intimacy. And we can't talk about, I think no conversation about drawings and paintings is complete without talking about how artists apply ink, what is their approach to ink on paper. And since you are yourself an instructor of studio practice, you teach students of fine arts, I'm very curious to understand what is your approach towards using ink on paper, which is what you do here. And perhaps if you can also make a connection with how you see Mithila artists using ink here in this paper.
So studio classes, if we're talking about studio practice in the United States, particularly in higher education, and in particular creating a space for our students to think about becoming a professional artist. There was a whole legacy of understanding that materials or mediums like oil paint made you more of a serious artist. And reason being, at least in many schools, when women were not allowed to be educated in that profession, they were relegated to water media, watercolor being that medium at that time, and gouache and paper. And men worked in oil painting, had painting degrees. Women would get a degree in illustration, book design, for example. These kinds of division created commodities. And they could do so by suggesting that this group of people would not have access to these things, and this group of people would have access. Therefore, they couldn't cross each other. And it would therefore be transparent to the consuming industry what is more important and what is less important. The organization of this, of what is more important, what is less important, would be then facilitated by every sector, even those who were in a lesser position, because it created some sense of stability for everyone. The lack of movement and lack of trespassing that could be facilitated. What we have now, because thanks to a little bit of science knowledge, is that we associate our new commodities, original work even, by trespasses. You can be inspired by Aboriginal art, be interested in making works that look like, talk to, or is aware of that art, and talk about multiple places in the world that enter into your work. And they can make your work look nourished by it without the kind of conversation about how trespassing is a vehicle that undermines your authenticity as an artist. And I think those kinds of complicated conversations allow us an intimacy of reach. And it will continue to be like that because we are people with interest in mobility. We do not like to be contained. And we saw that during COVID, I'm afraid. That is very hard, and it's very unhealthy to not be social for us. And that requires our mobility, our freedom, and we get bored when we don't have the kind of stretch that we aspire to in our lives to make us feel like even time itself can be malleable out of our reach.
You talked about trespassing and how multiple spaces enter into artists' work. And there's an interest in mobility. And in fact, because we do not want to be contained in one place, that also makes us think about how do borders work. Are borders porous? Are they concrete? When we cross them, what happens? And here in the Mithila paintings, one of the visual aspects of these painting that ties them together are these very, very clear delineated borders on the edges of the painting. They create margins of the painting in a very clear way that artists spent a lot of time in. And here in your drawings, at least as I see it, these 4 drawings do not have borders, but we can tell that at least on the surface of it, that's where the limits of the work is ending, but that is of course not so. And I was very curious to know, there is a way that you're negotiating space in your drawings. They are not contained, as you said, especially this particular drawing and this drawing, which is circular in nature. And also your sculptures, for example, the Taj cannot be rooted to the ground, it's floating. If the ceiling were higher, it could float even, it could soar even higher. As also the two sculptures in the other galleries, Viola as well as a world loss. There is a way they are trying to break the boundaries of what space or borders would constrict them. I wanted to know, how do you negotiate the idea of space in your work?
Well, the space is always a variable situation depending on the site in which you show your work. And in many ways, sculptures takes into account the possibilities of what those spaces are when making a sculpture. Is it going to be a white space? Is it going to be in somebody's home? So the new home of the sculpture or the new place that it will show, it has to have some adaptability to the space. I wouldn't say my works can entertain a significant change in space. In many ways, we are really kind of attuned to the fact that gallery spaces, have drywall, as these walls are, as opposed to a stone wall versus a brick wall. And we're very aware of that. And it allows us to be placed, the work itself be placed in a kind of language that we've created around contemporary art, where what we call a neutral space is memorized into the work. And I think that artists really enjoy having spaces that are not neutral and create challenge for the work. We describe it as a challenge for the work. But in fact, it is a place that the work can be seen to derive more meaning because there's a kind of identity to the space. A lot of contemporary buildings are interested in losing identity, becoming bland. And as I heard Rolingo once say, become beige. I think that there's a driving force of creating a neutrality that we accept is a way in which we can sell to a larger and larger expanding audience because there's no resistance when a space has no identity. And we do that in the way we package ourselves, our bodies. We want to fit in, we want to have more friends, more people accept us, to have more mobility because more people accept us. If I dress in a certain way, I have more mobility. If I have a particular color of skin, I have more mobility. I wish I had that color of skin so I had more mobility. I'm going to change the color of my hair so I'll become more popular. All these things, including what one does to their work, is very aware of what the consumption of that trade is, the art trade. And we have to choose in our careers whether we like to sink in it, swim in it, float in it, or fly, be rejected. All these things are being thought about in the studio practice. And I think it's very important to realize how recognition, identity, neutrality have very concrete ways in which it moves through your minds in terms of your recognition to it. That the ideology that it suggests it is obvious, that it's visible, even when a place looks as neutral as these gallery walls. And so these white drywall spaces are an invention of the West to create neutrality. But in fact, it's not neutral because it identifies a way of exhibiting that is invested in signifying the white walls as neutral. That's a language. And so it's sort of like you don't question that it's cold in Alaska. you believe it, but you've never really been to Alaska. So it becomes that thing. And that's important to think about when visiting the museum. What does the museum look like? How is the work made to resist the museum or work with the museum? These are difficult questions, and they're questions that you want to think about because they allow you to think about your life, the choices you've made, to be truly the choices you want and what you desire, and how much does what you desire embank on what is ideologically dominant in your life.
Speaking of making art, and I have a final question. Okay, should we close the conversation?
We should have a Q&A.
Okay, thank you for those responses, Rina. We're going to close this conversation because we are running out of time. But we have some time for Q&As. Anybody has questions for Rina or for me, you're most welcome to raise your hands.
So you speak about like how you moved around and you eventually ended up in New York, and how I was curious how moving and seeing different cultures, how that influenced your work, and how we can see like your ability to get that intimacy without the borders is shown through that life, through your life experiences.
I'm glad you brought that up. I actually am in New York because my parents brought me to New York, so I'm very lazy. That way I have not left the place I grew up. I hope to. And I think I have had a little more travel than my parents have. But in no way am I really familiar with all that's out there in terms of culture. We don't have those kinds of mobility. In a place like New York, you sense that there's a large world out there from, the people who you see. It's like a crossroad where there is flow from the rest of the world. It's a port. It's a loading dock, and it allows you to know that there's a big world out there. There, in reality, the visa you have to get, the reasons for leaving have to be more concrete, we believe, because there's great danger in moving away from what you're familiar with. And you have to have a license and privilege and access. You're made to feel that way. If I said, even at my age, if I said, I want to live in, I want to live in Crete, I would ask myself, how did I come to that realization? How is that going to be facilitated? Maybe I'll need to have a job. Am I independently wealthy? Will I like the food? What could I adjust? And will I make friends? Will they talk to me? Will I feel lonely? Will I be accepted? These are things we think about more so in some places than others. And it allows for the places that we think we have access to being more of an influence in our lives. Right? And those places that we don't know the answers to those questions, we reject. And so we're constantly being schooled to stay with the school of thought that made us in the place we're from. And I think it takes a lot of doing and a lot of time to really edge into the adventure that we're encouraged to take on in our lives when you go away to university.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Was there any particular reason you want to explore the theme of love through your art?
Yeah, I think art for me is made with understanding that it creates an emotion of experience, and it enjoys the possibility that emotion is not to be minimized, and that it is what is thinking. Thinking happens with the emotion. it is intellectual to have an emotion. And I think with all the different languages we have created, we still feel like at this point that we can go to anything that is visual, that is not our language, that we don't have to be already educated in a language to look at art. And it comes out of the emotion of love for the visual and what the visual can promise to us, to create joy. Those things come out of seeing.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, please.
This is kind of a basic question, but what initially drew you to create art in the first place? Like, why did you feel like this was the career path that you wanted to go down?
There is no path that's clear. Don't even bother waiting for that to happen. You do have to make decisions, and the important thing is you can change your mind. And that's hard to allow yourself, but I think there's always time where, even after you've invested yourself for 20 years, I remember thinking, I don't want to ever make sculpture again. I want to change this. And then it becomes a time where, more people are involved in your decision, and so there are, pressures that throw you in one direction or another. But you should always feel like, I need a change now, and I'm going to make it. You had a question.
I wanted to ask, for the painting of Boy, was there any context or any experiences that encouraged the creation of it?
Well, it was really a childhood experience where you could be ridiculed for being an ugly girl, and your beauty was always being measured as you grew from the little baby to adulthood. Your value in the world is measured by your beauty. And it seemed that if you were a boy, your beauty was not as important, that you could be an ugly boy. And if you were an ugly boy, and there were ugly boys in school, it was considered adorable to see an ugly boy. And, so there is that kind of play on gender that is about tradition and conventions of beauty that is in the work. Ugly boy here, as you see him, has a disproportionately large head. There is always that fear in your parents' eyes if you were growing properly. Your legs are too long, or head is too big. Does he have enough hair? Ugly boy here has a very strange accumulation of hairs in all the wrong places. So it's a lot of fun painting some people that are not the ideal beauty, which is, of course, what can sell a painting as well.
Thank you, Rina. On that beautiful note, we will close this conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
And I want to invite you all to join us outside for a reception where we have samosas, cookies, and tea sponsored by the Republic of Tea. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation during our reception. Thank you.
Thank you.